Today I will be showing you how to make traditional buckwheat noodles, also known as soba, from Asia. So in a stainless steel bowl, I add a cup of dark buckwheat flour, all of it into the bowl, half a cup of spelt flour. You can also use all-purpose and kaput flour, and then the recipe calls for 130 to 150 milliliters of water, hot water, but because of the properties of the dark buckwheat, I had to use more than that. So here I am mixing up the dough. Mixing while I mix. Let me tell you a little bit about the history. Soba noodles originated in Japan and are made of primarily buckwheat flour or all buckwheat flours, but can contain other types of flours such as kamut and spelt, which I'm using here. You can also use all-purpose flour or other wheat flours. Soba noodles that do contain 100% buckwheat can often be brittle and tough to work with and blend. You'll see that I have that problem later on in the video. The noodle has about the same thickness as spaghetti and is often eaten cold with soya-based dipping sauces. Another thing to note about soba is that in Japan there are some dishes in the word soba, such as yakisoba, chaka soba, or Okinawa soba, but these dishes do not contain buckwheat noodles. They are just named for it. Here I am adding more water because this dough is very, very dry, as you can see. I had extra hot water just in case this flour needed it, because traditionally you use buckwheat flour. I'm using dark buckwheat flour, which I didn't know whether or not that made a difference, so I had extra water with it. There are a few notable soba dishes that actually do contain soba noodles, like moi or suo soba, which is a popular cold soba dish that often is served with dried seaweed and a soya-based dipping sauce. Tokyoshi soba, which is eaten during the New Year's for longevity. Generally, those noodles are very, very long. Kake soba, which I will tell you about in a second, because now you can see me dumping the flour out onto the table, or the dough, as it should be, out on the table, since it wasn't mixing anymore in the bowl. So I'm going to mix it by hand from here on, adding small bits of water here and there in order to get a dough-like consistency. For a while I thought this dough was not going to come together, but with a little bit of persistence and some elbow grease, it comes together quite nicely. This dough is a more traditional dough where it contains more buckwheat than normal soba, making it drier and more brittle and harder to work with, especially for someone who has never worked with this buckwheat noodles before, like me. But as you can see, the dough is coming together rather quickly when you do it by hand. So if I were to make them again, I probably would start doing it by hand from the get-go and forget about the whole spoon and bowl thing and just do it right out on the table like I am doing here. This dough is notably dry, whereas a normal pasta dough wouldn't be as dry at this point, but there's also only 3 ingredients, whereas pasta dough sometimes it has egg in it, or has more water in it, and it's just a bit of a more moisture dough because the flour itself doesn't soak up as much water. There I am, just cleaning up all the dry flour bits that are trying to escape from me. They're not allowed to. So I was saying kake soba, which is much like a cold soba, like the mori or soba, but it is warm with less concentrated broth, because most sobas are served with a soup. And then tempura soba, which is served either hot or cold with a few pieces of tempura and with either a hot or a cold sauce or a broth. So as you can see, I'm just rolling the dough into somewhat of a ball now, getting all the extra bits up. The dough to me was a little dry, so you can see me adding some more water into it. But at this point I thought that the dough had enough hydration in it to be able to roll out in a moment. I can tell you that it has a very strong buckwheat smell to it, and it feels rather different from a traditional dough. So now I can begin the process of actually rolling it out and cutting it into the noodles. To do that, you make it a ball, flatten it out, and then, as you can see me doing, trying to make it into a rectangle, I pull out my bench scraper and squish the sides together so I can get as much of a rectangular shape as possible. It looks kind of like a block of clay now, funny enough. It actually kind of has the texture of a dry clay too, that you haven't added enough water to hydrate it. And now I'm beginning to roll it out. Rolling it out is rather easy if you put at the beginning a small amount of pressure and then a lot of pressure, and trying to thin it in a few section by section. Trying to go all at once right across actually causes the dough to shrink and contract, which is very frustrating when you're trying to roll it out very thin. Also, I don't have any flour down at this point because the dough is surprisingly not sticky, but at this point it does start to stick a little bit to the table, so I do put some flour down just so I don't have to use the bench scraper on the table and risk damaging the table. As you can see, I'm going section by section, trying to go longer at the back end, but that's where it starts to shrink on me. So I flip it and try to roll it out a little more. As you can probably see, it keeps trying to kind of shrink on me. And this is the point where I figure out that you have to go kind of section by section and just try to thin it out. But it is relatively easy once you figure out how to make it very thin. It goes very thin very quickly, which is what the awesome thing about this dough is. So I'm just going to continue to roll it out. The exact origins of soba noodles it was kind of hard to find. It was more like they just were there and have always been there. There wasn't really a date of when they came into existence or really where the origins was from. It just always had been a part of the Japanese culture to have soba noodles. Interesting fact about the soba noodles, other than the flour I'm using to dust them with, it is actually gluten-free. So buckwheat and kamut flour do not contain gluten, and therefore this is actually a vegan and gluten-free pasta. It tear a little bit, but I kind of pinched it back together to make it all one piece again. And I'm making sure it is not sticky at all, so I can then fold it and begin cutting it. So this is how you would traditionally cut soba noodles. They have a very special type of knife to do it, which is like a long rectangle with a handle, and the top side of the rectangle, and then like where a point of a traditional knife, and then the bottom where a knife blade is, are both very sharp. And then as you can see, I'm cutting them out into thin strips, kind of like a linguine, and then unfolding them. But as you'll see, some of them start to break. Now it feels like a strong dough, but then it starts to kind of break and tear, and that's because of the high amount of the buckwheat in it. That's just making them brittle. So that was a problem with most of the noodles, is that they kind of started to just break in half where I had folded the dough. So another way to do this without them breaking is to use a traditional pasta making machine, and then with a fettuccine cutter, use that in one long strip. In the recipe I'm using, it was recommended to just leave it one whole thing and then cut the strips with a knife, but that would have been quite difficult, so I chose to go the most traditional route and fold the dough. I do not know how the master soba noodle makers do it, but I wish they would share their secrets with me, because most of the noodles just broke in half, which was okay because they were a nice size when they were cooked. This was me going and prepping the water for the soba noodles. So the making of soba noodles dates back thousands of years, and there are master soba noodle makers. Traditional soba noodle dough does not contain salt, as the recipe I'm using here, but commercial soba noodles do contain a good amount of salt, to avoid having to heavily salt the water that they are cooked in, and that's just to give them more of a flavor to them. I found that these noodles have a very, very buckwheat note, which makes sense. Here I am, all the noodles are rolled out, and I am putting them into the boiling water. Now, I didn't use any flour to keep them from sticking together because they're very dry noodle, which was kind of weird because they were very dry, but they didn't fall apart too much other than them breaking in half, and they weren't sticky at all, so I could just kind of bunch them all together and then just stir them with the chopsticks and cook them, and they cook for a couple minutes. So this is before